Amen. If you are able to, please stand for the reading of the word. Our scripture reading for today is found in Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 9. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." This is the word of the Lord.
Amen. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Hope Church. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. We're delighted to have you. We're actually in this historic season of the church called Lent, which churches around the world actually commemorate this season. It's actually a season in which the Christian community, as well as those outside the Christian community, are looking forward to, in the Christian calendar, what leads to the death and the resurrection of Jesus, which we as Christians believe is a historical event that really happened. Now, in this season of Lent, it really is a time for us to have a narrow focus on what is the Christian faith about, especially as it relates to the life of Jesus. Now, we believe that Jesus was actually a historical person. He's not some sort of mythical figure, but he's actually someone who lived and died and resurrected from the grave. And we believe that human history has forever changed because of this person named Jesus. Now, with all that's happening in the world, if you're not a Christian here, I just want to say welcome. Or maybe you're someone you're just exploring faith again, and I just want to say welcome. This is a great series to be here because, again, we're looking at what is the original source material about who this Jesus fellow really is. Not who people say he is, but really what are the eyewitness accounts of Jesus, and what did he have to do and say, and what are some of the historical stories about him? So we've been looking, especially in this Lenten series, there's a historian named Luke, who's also a doctor, who wrote and recounted different stories and eyewitness accounts of the teachings and the sayings of Jesus. And so that's what we've been looking at week after week. And today we actually see this picture. It's actually an episode where Jesus engages with someone, and if you've been with us over the last few weeks, you know in the Gospel of Luke, you see how Jesus is this person who's upending all sorts of social norms. The people that he's interacting with, they're not the people that normal kind of ancient Jewish people would have thought that the Messiah, the person that they thought was going to deliver them, would interact with. And you see how Jesus has this amazing breadth of who he's actually interacting with and welcoming into a life with God. And it's really stunning. It's everyone from like a Roman centurion to basically a widow in Nain, to different people who are kind of considered ceremonially unclean. And so you see how Jesus is actually showing and displaying that the way of the kingdom of God is actually this massive, expansive way of welcoming people that normally in today's society people would think those people are so far from God. They are people that could never experience the kindness of God. And yet, Jesus is someone who actually interacts in this very human, personal way with each one of them. And today is no different in the story that was read for us. So as Jesus is on this journey, we look at this encounter with a man named Zacchaeus. Now notice how this passage begins. It says that Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. Again, notice these little clues of Jericho and these roads. This is a historical account. This is not just some fictitious tale or a parable. And notice what it says. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. Now, these names, again, are given because these are historical figures. And it says, he was a chief tax collector and he was wealthy. Now, what does this mean? Well, Zacchaeus was actually someone who was ethnically Jewish, but in the ancient world, especially during this time, it was actually under the rule of Rome. And so ancient Rome actually was the oppressor over this entire region. And so Judea and the surrounding areas were basically under the oppressive rule of Rome. Now, Zacchaeus, who's ethnically Jewish, it says that he's a chief tax collector. So tax collectors had this role of basically enacting taxes from the oppressor towards their own people. But what tax collectors were often known to do was tax collectors were people that were actually not only taxing their own people on behalf of Rome, but oftentimes these tax collectors would tax them even more and take off the top. So as a result, you could imagine ethnically Jewish people would look at these tax collectors and be like, you guys are such sellouts. How in the world could you do this? You guys are basically working for the empire. Now, notice what it says, though. It says that he was a chief tax collector. So not only is Zacchaeus someone who's enacting these taxes for himself, but he's also part of the system, of this oppressive system, as a chief tax collector who oversaw other tax collectors. So you can see how Zacchaeus then would be someone who would be despised by his own people. Because they're like, yo, you're totally selling out, man. How could you do this? How could you be someone who's actually from New York and rooting for the Red Sox? No, I'm just kidding. But do you get the idea, though, that it's someone who somehow, you're playing for the wrong team. What in the world are you doing? But notice it's also pointed out that he's wealthy. Now, of course, he'd probably be wealthy because even though he's part of this oppressive group, he probably has amassed wealth that is unusual for someone who's ethnically Jewish. Now, notice what it says. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see. Now, there's this historical account, like Zacchaeus, by the way, it's kind of like, man, he's really throwing Zacchaeus under the bus in terms of he's trying to describe as fully as possible. He's like, listen, this brother was short. And because he was short, he actually could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, now why is it that Zacchaeus was so eager to see Jesus? Well, if you've been with us over the last few weeks, you know that Jesus is actually proven to be this incredible miracle worker who opens the eyes of the blind, who raises the dead, and who teaches with incredible authority. So even though Zacchaeus, along with everyone else, like even whatever background they might come from, people are flocking to see this Jesus fellow. And so Zacchaeus, he's so desperate to see Jesus, he will climb up a tree because he's short. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up the tree and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. Do you see? It's like Jesus is basically taking this step to welcome Zacchaeus and to actually say, I'm going to eat at your house today. Now, notice what happens, though, because immediately this was a significant moment, especially in ancient Near Eastern custom. To be invited into someone's home was a place of incredible honor. You know, in the same way, New York is a little bit like that, right? It's not like, hey, let's go meet at the Pret or let's go meet at, Panera or something like that. It's, hey, come into my house. Now, you and I know, like in New York, again, to invite someone into such small private quarters is a big thing. Well, even more so in the ancient world, because hospitality was such an incredible value. And so when Jesus is actually saying, I want to stay at your house, it's like this moment of saying, like, I want to actually form a deeper kind of relationship with you. But because of this moment and this movement, look at what it says. All the people saw this, and because of Zacchaeus' reputation, they began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Oh, snap. Like this, it was like, people are just like, wait, Jesus, of all the people that you want to spend time with, that you'd want to be entered, that you would want to go into their home and actually befriend in relationship, is this fellow the person who Jewish people despise? The Romans don't really respect him. He's just doing things to help the oppressor. Of all the people, it's this guy. Now, here's what's so interesting. Again, in the Gospel of Luke, one of the things that we see is time and time again, Jesus had this moniker that was given to him. And it was basically that he was a friend of sinners and drunkards. In fact, there's one time where he calls Matthew, who's a tax collector, and Levi, as well as other tax collectors. And he starts to hang out with all these tax collectors, these people who are seen as like, oh my goodness, these traitors, these sellouts. And what's crazy is Jesus has this moniker as friend of sinners and drunkards. That was Jesus' reputation. Now, in this story then, it's so subversive because again, here he's interacting with this fellow named Zacchaeus, who actually is part of that class that they would deem them, they're sinners so far from God. But it's just like Jesus that's who he's interacting with. Now, here's the thing. There's two things that are used to describe Zacchaeus. It's that he's wealthy and that he's despised. Now, it makes sense. I just explained to you how he probably amassed his wealth was probably through unscrupulous means and as someone who's seen as a sellout to his people. And he's also despised. Again, he's looked down upon. And as I was thinking, what's the equivalent of someone in today's society who is wealthy and despised? And you know what I was thinking? That's a New Yorker. Who's wealthy and despised? It's us. As I was thinking about it, I'm like, you know what? That's kind of like New York. Here we are. The city is basically comprised of people who the rest of the country and the rest of the world, they look at New York and like, oh, they're so lucky to live there, but oh man, they're so elitist in different ways. New York, especially to be able to make it in the city and especially as a way to survive here and to grow up here and to raise families, usually there's a way in which New York itself is full of a lot of wealthy people. And believe it or not, you and I, we tend to be very despised because of that, this belief that, oh my goodness, New Yorkers can be really wealthy and despised. When I was thinking about this myself, and I realized this is not a one-to-one equivalent, so it was just a way for me to basically tie in New York to this. But isn't it true? New York, in terms of the values that our city carries, and the values that allow us to actually be in the city, there's a value of, just like Zacchaeus, there's a part of me that's incredibly sympathetic to Zacchaeus. Why? Because, as much as he's despised for being a tax collector, he's simply working the system for his advantage. As someone who is who is short, and so as a result, he didn't have that going for him. As someone who's thinking about, gosh, how am I supposed to flourish in a society where I'm basically under an oppressive regime? All Zacchaeus is doing is something that honestly, part of me commends him for it. I'm like, man, the brother is basically trying to survive in ancient Judea under the hand of Rome. And what he's basically doing is he's just trying to survive. Not only is he surviving, though, he's also amassed a great deal of wealth. In other words, he's just playing the game. Don't hate the player, hate the game. And yet this is what Zacchaeus is doing. And in many ways, in New York, it's kind of similar. Because there's a mantra that oftentimes when I think of the city that I think marks the way that animates our lives here. And here's the mantra. It's survival of the fittest. Survival of the fittest. Isn't that what New York is all about? We come here and this is one of the most competitive cities in the world. And in fact, there's a saying here, and you've probably heard this saying before. If you can make it in New York, you can make it anywhere. And in many ways, each one of us, we're all grinding, trying to survive here, trying to make it, trying to make ends meet. And in many ways, that in some ways adds to the mystique and the culture of our city. It's a place where people are super competitive in whatever industry you might be in, whether you're an artist, a teacher, a lawyer, in finance, in all of these different areas in New York has a certain kind of culture in which it's the survival of the fittest. Only the best survive. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And you know what? Honestly, there's a part of me that's why I'm here. I love that challenge of the city. In fact, it animates me. I want to be around other people who are hungry for being the best at the best of the best. And in many ways, there's a part of me that's sympathetic to Zacchaeus because simply what he's doing is he's survival of the fittest. I mean, he's basically a natural product of this mantra of survival of the fittest. If you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. And in New York, when I think about what drives a lot of this city, as well as other global cities around the world, it often is this drive to be the best and to, listen, whatever playground we're playing in, to actually work within that system and make as much as we can. Now, Zacchaeus, maybe he's aware of this, maybe he's unaware of this. We don't exactly know, but at the end of the day, what drives him is probably this idea that, listen, I'm just playing the game in the empire. Now, as I think about, though, other kinds of values that tend to drive the human spirit, but not only the human spirit in today's cultural moment in places like New York, but even around the world, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff, they actually wrote a book, and here's the book. It's called The Coddling of the American Mind. And what's interesting is in this book, they actually talk about some of the different cultural changes that have existed, especially in recent times, that have shaped the way that people are raising their children and the values that tend to shape us when it comes to what motivates us for life with some of the bigger questions of our lives. And in this book, the things that they actually kind of recount is basically how different value systems that have shaped our world today is how the next generation is being raised in such a manner to avoid all pain. And that if anything, younger generations, they need to be coddled, or, he says that's the word that they used. They need to be coddled and protected from all that is harmful or disagreeable in the world. And because of this mindset, they actually talk about how the next generation can be a very fragile kind of generation. A generation that whenever something disagreeable comes, whenever a little bit of difficulty emerges within their lives, people are prone to want to quit or to look for something else, which is why there are skyrocketing views and research on anxiety, depression, and difficulty, is because somehow the American psyche has actually been shaped by this belief that somehow we're supposed to be protected from anything that is harmful. Now, here's what's interesting, is that honestly, I came from a family of origin, immigrant background. My parents were actually products, they were children of the Korean War. And so they immigrated here, and all they knew was hustle and difficulty. Like, they would constantly tell me, listen, we came to this country with nothing, and we did jobs that no one wanted to do, but we worked hard to make a living for you so that you could be someone who makes a lot of money and all this. And so listen, that mantra in my mind, it's been so stamped in me. So believe me now, here I am, second generation, went through the struggle of also being a second generation immigrant kid where my parents didn't speak English well, constant racial epithets growing up in Los Angeles, and then trying to make it improve myself as an ethnic minority in the country. Like, there's a part of me that I feel like, that grind, that pain, I know that feeling. And so when we had kids, believe me, like, when I read this book, I was like, I will do anything to save them from any kind of pain. In fact, I was so thorough in everything that we did when we had a newborn in trying to protect and clean and spaces and trying to make sure that they could never, I had this dream that it will never be my fault if they ever get sick, like I will do anything I can to create as clean and hospitable an environment for them so they don't have to experience pain. Believe me, as a parent right now, because of the pain of my background, my parents' generation, as well as my own, there's a part of me that doesn't want my kids to feel any pain or go through any kind of difficulty. And I imagine, though, that's the same psyche that many of us are familiar with. This psyche that, we're supposed to somehow be immune from suffering or difficulty. Now, again, whether it's this survival of the fittest, like we're the strongest, only the strongest survive, or whether it's this, well, let's coddle the American mind, let's coddle kind of even the way that we think about what is the meaning of life. If it's not succeeding, then maybe it's self-protection. Or there's another kind of narrative that exists in the world about what is important and what are we living for. And it's probably this. Here's this picture. It's a picture of be happy. Pursue your own happiness. There's this story of this is what matters in life the most. If you haven't heard this explicitly, well, if you've watched any Disney films, you know this story immensely. Right? There's all these different narratives that end up shaping, whether we know it or not, explicitly or implicitly, the way that we go about life and the things that we value. And Zacchaeus, now here's the thing, the common thread that exists for all of these different narratives, either survival of the fittest, if you can make it in New York or you can make it anywhere, or the coddling of the American mind, where it's basically the purpose of your life is so that you would go through life without any kind of difficulty and be kind of cocooned from the rest of the realities of the world. Or the story of, you know what life is about? Life is about your happiness and what matters for you and kind of how you can perceive the greatest amount of happiness over and against whatever circumstance that you're in. All of these different narratives, what they do is they all have a certain story about the self, where I am the king of the universe, I am the master of my own fate, I need to be self-protected, self-protective, I need to live for me, myself, and maybe my family. That's the general story that exists in the world today, in the culture that we live in. And honestly, there's a part of me that's really sympathetic to Zacchaeus because honestly, he's wealthy and despised. And a part of me is like, listen, he's just playing the game and trying to make as much money as he can. Feels like a lot of New Yorkers to me. Now, here's what's stunning though, because look at what happens in this story. What happens in this story is so profound because that same self-centered kind of mantra and belief that Zacchaeus had is the same one that even today modern man has. There's always this gravitational pull towards the self. But notice what happens in this story. When Zacchaeus he has Jesus in his home, and look at what it says. Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, this is after Zacchaeus has welcomed Jesus into his house. He says, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. Now, why is that significant? Especially in the Jewish faith, there was a belief that 10% to 30%, some scholars say, that was the belief of what was to be given to the poor. And now here he goes over and he says, actually half of my possessions are given to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Now, notice what happens is that Zacchaeus, after meeting Jesus, the one thing that has helped him amass so much of his own privilege is his money. But after meeting Jesus, first, he basically says, half of my possessions. He goes way over the expectation of 10 to 30%. And then he says, and if I've cheated anyone, now in the book of Numbers, it talks about how if you were to cheat anyone, then you should give back at least 20% more. But notice what he says. He actually says, I'm going to give back 400%, 4 times as much. 4 times the amount. And Jesus said to, wait, did I do that math right? I don't know if I did that math right. Nonetheless, humanities major. And notice what Jesus said. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now, do you see what's happened to Zacchaeus? Like, there have been so many things that have probably animated his life. He's wealthy and he's despised. He's someone that's basically lived for himself in this very particular way for most of his life. And then he has this meeting with Jesus, and all of a sudden, he makes this declaration in front of everyone. Half of my possessions. 4 times, anyone that I've cheated. And now, it's like this incredible way of saying, the things that I've been living for, I want to begin to live for something different. And it's stunning. Now, there's a part of me when I look at this story, and then what's amazing is Jesus, when he hears this proclamation, look at how Jesus responds. He said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Now, a part of me, when I read this response from Jesus, a part of me is kind of like, Jesus, like, seriously, you just met the guy. Like, the cynical New Yorker in me is like, Jesus, come on, you can't let this guy just make one pronouncement and all of a sudden you're saying salvation has come to the house. You need to give him like a probationary period, like 3 to 6 months at least, but preferably a year. See whether this change is real in this guy. I mean, isn't that true? Like, as most New Yorkers, we're kind of suspicious. And a part of me is like, Jesus, how could you get duped so easily by this guy who, he makes this pronouncement, he's talking a big game, but he hasn't really done anything. Yet why is it that Jesus, with such clarity and such conviction, can make such a pronouncement about Zacchaeus? How can Jesus say, salvation has come to this house? Like, it's like, Jesus, you just met the guy. Now, why is it? Why? It's because, did you notice, for Zacchaeus, his experience of Jesus is so short-lived. But this short-lived experience actually leads into a very tangible change. And what is that change? It's the change of his pocketbook. The change of his money. And the reality is, the reason why Jesus can say with such clarity that salvation has come to this house, it's because the one thing that is often the hardest to give up is our cold, hard cash. And what Jesus is basically pointing out, he's like, you know what? This is a sign, because money is often the hardest thing and the last thing to give up. I'll give you my thoughts, I'll give you my prayers, I'll give you some of my time, but money, that's a little bit too personal, a little bit too tactile, a little bit too real. And yet Jesus is able to correctly identify. See, when he sees that Zacchaeus he's made that kind of leap, the leap that actually touches his cold, hard cash, that it's then he's able to say, like, salvation has come to this house. Now, you and I, whether we like it or not, we probably believe this to be true. And the reason why I say that is because just like there's sayings that animate our city, like if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere, there's also sayings about money as well. For instance, have you heard this saying? And you can just fill in the blank. Put your money where your... That's right. You really believe that? Then put your money where your mouth is. Now, what does that saying even mean? What it means is, yeah, honestly, if you really believe that, then let it touch your money. Put some money on it. Put your money where your mouth is. Now, it's interesting, right? Because Jesus is able to actually correctly discern with Zacchaeus. He's able to pronounce salvation has come to this house because somehow Zacchaeus, what is often the last kind of standing thing that we hold on to as human beings, Zacchaeus has finally been able to relinquish, to signal that he's not shaped by the same kind of value systems that often drive the people in his day. Survival of the fittest. Just live a life where you're self-protected and where you don't go through anything difficult. Or your life is just about your happiness. Actually, over and against all of those different stories that perhaps Zacchaeus has been living by, or how any of us today in New York have been living. There's a story that has now changed for Zacchaeus, where now he's not living for any of those narratives. He's living for something bigger than himself. And in fact, it so has animated and infiltrated his life that now it actually touches his money. And here's what Jesus' pronouncement shows us. It shows us that over and against all these stories that tell us that living for yourself is the better way, that's the most fulfilling way for your life, there's now a story that actually grace or generosity is actually the better way. High five your neighbor and say, grace is the better way. Now, if you think about it, like where else in the world, where else in the city do we hear this kind of story? If anything, like I said, the story of the city is, hey, look out for yourself. Make whatever you can to make ends meet for yourself. And try to exploit the city as much as you can. And to come out here net positive would be a great thing for you, especially when it comes to your money. And look out for yourself. And some of us, we came and we actually did believe in another story, a story of generosity is the better way. But what ends up happening, you start living in the city long enough and you try to be generous and then people take advantage of it. And then all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, no one else is living according to this story. Everyone else is trying to take advantage of me. I better just look out for myself. And so as a result, we've been betrayed or hurt a few times. And so as a result, again, that same story just keeps circling back. Just live for yourself. Live to be happy. Live to be self-protected for you, yourself, and your family, and that's it. And yet here, I mean, just think about how profoundly different this story is. This story of actually generosity and grace is the better way. Now, that is a crazy story. And yet the story of the Christian faith has always been a story that life is not about you and me and our own kind of self-desires and happiness. It's always been about a bigger story. Which, honestly, I think that most of us would agree that that story is an awfully compelling one. But how in the world do we even live that way? And yet in Zacchaeus, we see this willingness to live. Now, his life has so been changed to now say generosity is the better way. Now, some of you guys are like, oh my goodness, there that pastor goes again talking about money. Churches are constantly talking about money. Now he's going to make this plea about why the church needs your money. And so please, everyone, pull out your bank accounts right now and start giving your money. So I'd love for you to pull out. No, I'm just kidding. Of course not. Listen, whenever we've had these talks on money as a church, you all know, I've told you all, like, I don't need your money. And I've told you this time and time again. In fact, other people who have been part of our church, they know that I say this regularly. I don't need your money because my wife is independently wealthy. So like, listen, my salary is half the amount of a church normally our size. So listen, I take half of a salary of what churches our size normally make. We are trying to live as generously as we can. And I just want you to know, I don't need your money. And our church has done our best to be as open with finances as possible. We give a full financial report on Friday night at our town hall. And you can see that our little church, we have been disproportionately generous in the way that we use our money. Our church last year, we gave around $400,000 to different causes completely outside of our church community. And in addition to that, we helped save close to $200,000 from other organizations and churches with our facility, The Hub, by offering it at a quarter of the market rate. So listen, our little church was able to give a little bit over $500,000 away to different outside organizations because we're trying to lead the way in generosity as a church community. Listen, our church doesn't need your money. And actually, Dave Jennings, if he heard me say that, he'd be like, Drew, don't say that, okay? So listen, It's not that I want anything from you. And I personally don't need anything from you because I got my wife. So listen, I'm sharing this because generosity is a better way. And you know what's interesting is as I think about my own life and journey here in New York, I really solidly kind of devoted my life to following Jesus in my college years. And then I decided that I wanted to go into vocational ministry. I ended up moving to New York in 2001 to go learn from a church in Queens. I signed up to become an intern at this church in Queens. And it was a church that had an incredible kind of reputation for serving the poor. And so I wanted to go and learn how to be a church that would serve the needs of the poor and the marginalized and the vulnerable. So I joined that church, and I remember meeting with the founding pastor, Pete Scazzaro, and asking him, so what's my salary gonna be? He goes, salary? He's like, there's no salary for you here. He's like, you have to raise support. And listen, as a college senior, when I told my parents that I'm gonna raise support, they were like, what in the world are you doing? And so I raised $7,500 for the year. And I lived off of that my first year out of college, interning at this church where I was learning how to set up for moms groups, how to do kids clubs in these different neighborhoods, and how to scrub a lot of toilets and serve people. And I look back at my 21-year-old self and I'm like, oh my goodness, I had such like crazy faith in God for like how God doesn't need a lot. And somehow I was able to survive. And then I look back at my life, and then from my 20s, getting different, scholarships to go to seminary, and then I still kept working at that church. And now I started to, start to save a little, start to give, start to save, and start to spend. And then I got married to my wife. My wife, she had already owned an apartment, so I was like, oh my goodness, I'm married up here, So she owned an apartment in the city, and now we were double income, no kids. And I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, like what a season. And so, yes, the baby just said yeah. And it was a season of like, we felt like we had it made, But again, this call towards generosity and giving, saving, spending. But now what's happening is in our own lives, we're amassing wealth and assets and that sort of thing. And then I went through a season right before the start of Hope where I was unemployed and I was really worried about money again. And then we decided to start this church, which became a collection of churches across the city. And so at the beginning, I was super worried about money. Anyone ever been there? You don't have to raise your hand. But this feeling of just being super worried about money. Will God allow ends to meet? And just being super afraid. But believing again, like God is calling us to take this step in faith and starting Hope and still wanting to live with generosity and believing that generosity is a better way. And you know what's crazy is that back then, it felt like such a massive faith step to start a church community and to be a place that would hopefully be a generative place of generosity. And, and then the church has grown and expanded and given away a lot of money and acquired different like properties or property right now at the hub. But if you were at the town hall, you heard about kind of some of our vision about what's happening in the East Village. But you know what's crazy is like as I look back on my life, like a part of me, I think about the faith that I had as a 21-year-old and the crazy like generosity, even though I didn't have that much money per se, but like wanting to step out in faith, in generosity back then. And a part of me thought like, oh, here we are today. And today, that same kind of faith and generous kind of spirit still exists. And a part of me, I just want you to know, the older I get, and now we have kids and we're thinking about their future, but like every season of my life, I realize it just gets harder and harder to believe the truth, this kind of moral vision that generosity is a better way. It's just harder and harder. Because, listen, the same stories that animate our city of survival of the fittest look out for yourself. Or the same stories of let's protect future generations, let's just protect ourselves. Or just live for your own happiness. Listen, those stories, they are seeped in my bones. And I'm a pastor. And then I come to passages like this and I'm like constantly confronted again. What is the grip that money has on me? That financial security or comfort has on me? And do I really believe that grace and generosity is the better way? The reason why Jesus can so clearly say salvation has come to this house, because money is often the final frontier. Put your money where your mouth is. That's why Jesus would say, where your money is, that's where your treasure is. He doesn't say where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. No. And why is that? Or where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. He doesn't say where your heart is, that's where your treasure is. Why? Because at the end of the day, your money is the greatest indicator of where your heart is. And the same is true for me, and the same is true even as I reflect upon life today and for us and our family. And so believe me, there was this humility that just kind of struck me as I was reflecting on this passage. God, what is it about money? Gosh, where it was so much easier to trust you back then. But even now, what does faith-filled generosity look like? Professor Robert Elzinga, who's a professor of economy or economics at the University of Virginia, in a recent interview, a friend was telling me that he talked about something called the sin bias coefficient. The sin bias coefficient. And when he was talking about generosity, he was saying that, he said, he lives by this principle of the sin bias coefficient. And what's the sin bias coefficient? It's each of us have a sin bias. Well, what is the coefficient then to battle our sin bias? And especially when it comes to generosity. And he said his sin bias coefficient is 3. So whenever he has an impulse to give generously, he says multiply that by 3, because his bias towards sin is 3 times as much. So that's his mantra for how to be generous. Now, each one of us have a different sin bias coefficient. And now some of you are just basically, oh, there Drew goes, he's gonna tell us to give a certain, listen, there's different teachings where Jesus is interacting with people, and he gives a different, like for the rich young ruler, he says to the rich young ruler, sell everything and follow me. In this example of Zacchaeus, he's giving half of his possessions, and he's paying back 4 times as much. So each person is different. And notice, even in this story, it's not like Jesus says to him, you know how you're going to become a Christian? You're going to become a Christian if you give all this money. He doesn't say that. Notice, Jesus doesn't give a prescriptive on any of these things. And the same thing when Professor Elzinga, he's talking about the sin bias coefficient. What is the coefficient for you when it comes to your bias towards self-protection? And what does God want to invite you perhaps to actually live into a value of deeper generosity? How different of a story is that? Now, some of you, listen, if you're like, listen, my sin bias coefficient is 0. Only Jeff Trong can say that, okay, everyone? No, I'm just kidding. He's not here, so you guys know Jeff, he's like sinless. Anthony's like, yep, I know. But even just as a self-confrontation, what might it look like for me to be someone of unusual generosity? Now, here's the thing though, right? What was it for Zacchaeus that changed things for him? What was it? There's a part of me that would honestly like to say, what changes things for people, what moves the needle for people when it comes to generosity? It's basically great sermons. If I could just preach on it more or give this classroom setting and that sort of. Well, did you notice it wasn't those things that changed things for Zacchaeus? What was it that could actually so infiltrate Zacchaeus that the last bastion of his own self-protection could actually be shattered into this vulnerable willingness to live into a different story? What is it? You know what it is? It's an encounter with Jesus that changes everything. It's basically Zacchaeus, he has this experience where even though he has the very things that most New Yorkers would say, yeah, he's a little despised, but he's wealthy, he's got power. He's got that thing that most of us would look at and be like, oh my goodness, he's made it. But what would actually undo everything for him? More than just a teaching or a Bible study, it's actually an encounter, a meeting with Jesus. It changes everything. It forever changes the trajectory of his life. He's met a person, and this relationship with this person fundamentally upends everything. See, more than like a doctrine or a catechism that can actually start to infiltrate your money, it comes with when any single one of us, when we've actually encountered the person of Jesus. That's the thing in the Christian faith that changes everything. It's when we've actually met and experienced a God. We experience his love, his forgiveness, his peace, his freedom. That's what ends up unlocking everything. And the same is true for Zacchaeus. It's when he's actually met Jesus, the one who would go out of his way to love him, to see him, and to know him. I mean, isn't it true? I tend to be most generous when my relationships have been fundamentally changed. And here's what I mean by that. Like when Tina and I, my wife and I, when things are good between us, it makes me a more generous person. When things are bad between us, so for instance, if things are kind of rocky between Tina and I, and my kids are like, hey, can we have dessert? I'm like, dessert? What do you mean? When I was a kid, I never got dessert. You know, my parents grew up in the Korean War time, and you guys I can't believe you're asking for dessert right now. Listen, things aren't good, I am stingy. But when Tina and I, when things are going swimmingly well, and we're full of love, and my kid's like, can I have dessert? I'm like, absolutely. You want chocolate chip cookie? You want ice cream with that? In fact, let's get whatever we can for dessert for you. There's something about when we've actually had this encounter, this experience with someone, when it changes everything about us, our countenance, our ability to be light and free-hearted and generous. And what changed things for Zacchaeus was he had experienced a love so profound, a freedom so real, that he realized, gosh, all of these different narratives that have been shaping my life, self-protection, survival of the fittest, be happy, can't live with any kind of difficulty. He actually comes away after meeting Jesus. And his immediate response is, every single area of my life, I realize I'm a free man. I'm not a slave to my self-protection anymore. I am fully loved. And I'm free to now be a loving person. I'm free to be a generous person. I'm so secure in God. I'm so secure in this relationship that I can touch every part of my life, even my money. And see, here's what the Christian story is. See, it's not just grace and generosity that's the better way. It's that Jesus is the better way. It's that when each one of us have actually had this encounter with Jesus, it fundamentally upends the things that we've been living for in life. It changes the way that we approach relationships, the way that we approach money, the way that we approach careers. Tim Keller once said, just as Zacchaeus went up the tree to see Jesus, Jesus went up the tree to die on the cross to show us that the God of the universe is so in love with us that this God who created the whole world and everything in it is a God of immense love for us. And if we believe that, if we finally can catch this encounter with Jesus, we can see that Jesus really does love us fully and completely and would be willing to die for us. It's only then that we can actually release our life to him. And one of the themes that we've been talking about in the Gospel of Luke, it's those who lose their lives actually find it. But those who are still grasping and striving to find their lives, as Jesus would say, that's when you know you've lost your life. Wouldn't any one of us want to live with that kind of freedom, that kind of levity, that kind of generosity? What if we as individuals, what if we as a congregation in this city started to live according to a different story? I'm going to invite us. Would you stand with me and the worship team come forward? Forgive me for going a little bit long here today.